2 weeks ago, my son moved into his new house. I decided to bring them a housewarming gift. But just as I reached the door, his neighbor ran out and shouted, "Don't go in." I have to tell you something. 5 minutes later, the police arrived. I am Patricia. I am 65 years old. Today I came to visit my son and his wife. I handed the driver a few dollars, smiled my thanks, and asked him to reach for the white orchid I had carefully placed in the back seat. It wasn't just a housewarming gift. It was also my hope. A wish for good beginnings for my son, Ethan, and his wife, Laura. After so many storms, I got out of the car and took a deep breath. In front of me was their new house, a 2-story home painted in a soft cream tone with a white picket fence and a small lawn out front. I felt a deep warmth in my chest. The pot in my hands seemed heavier, as if it contained all my dreams. I was about to push the wooden door, which still smelled of fresh paint, when a man from the house across the street, an elderly gentleman dressed in worn gardening clothes, ran toward me. He looked agitated, his face full of wrinkles marked by worry, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool weather. "Stop. Ma'am, don't go in there." He grabbed my arm with a rough, calloused hand, gripping tightly. I was startled. He was breathing heavily. "Don't go in. I have something urgent to tell you." I froze, not understanding what was happening, not even getting a chance to ask him who he was. When a police cruiser pulled up silently in front of the house, the blue and red lights flashed without the siren sounding, filling the quiet neighborhood with a strange tension. 2 tall officers stepped out of the vehicle, their faces serious. The older man immediately released me and turned to them as if he had just found a lifeline. He pointed to my son's house with a firm voice. "I already told you. I swear I heard a child crying from inside there." One of the police officers approached me, observing me carefully. "Ma'am, are you a relative of the homeowner?" I nodded, confused, my heart beating restlessly. What the heck was going on? The neighbor immediately turned to me, still agitated. "I'm Mr. Lewis, Ethan and his wife's neighbor. These past few days, I've heard a child crying, soft but constant, coming from their house. But I know perfectly well that they don't have children. I told myself maybe it was my imagination that I'm old and hearing things. But this morning, the crying was heartbreaking. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to ring the doorbell. I knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. I was afraid something bad had happened. That's why I called the police. Every word from Mr. Lewis chilled me further inside. I shook my head, trying to calm him and perhaps to calm myself. I smiled weakly. You must have heard wrong. Maybe it was the television or some stray cat in the yard. My son and his wife don't have small children. I said the last sentence firmly, like an indisputable truth, because more than anyone, I knew the pain they had suffered. But right at that moment, a whimpering sound broke all my attempts at justification. A muffled cry, weak but full of hurt, echoed from inside the house. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the morning, it sounded clear, like an icy needle piercing directly into my chest. It wasn't the television, nor a cat. It was, without a doubt, the cry of a child. I stood motionless. I felt the blood stop running through my veins. My back went cold and the pot in my hands felt like a stone. The two police officers didn't waste a second. They quickly communicated over the radio, and one of them went straight to the front door. He raised his hand and knocked on the wood with his knuckles. The dry sound echoed in the air. Police. Open the door. Silence was the only answer. Police. Open immediately, he repeated, his voice stronger and firmer. Still no response. Only the sobs. Lower now. Broken and full of fear. After several failed attempts to call, the officer in command gave a signal. The other took a lock-picking tool from the patrol car. A dry snap echoed in the air. The bolt broke. The door burst open. One of the police officers unholstered his weapon and entered cautiously, while the other remained on guard at the entrance. Mr. Lewis and I remained paralyzed, holding our breath. Every second passed slowly, like a century. My mind was blank. I could only hear the frantic pounding of my heart within my chest. And then a few seconds later, a voice shouted from deep within the house. The crying is coming from the basement. The basement. Those two words were like a hammer blow to my head. My hands went slack. The pot with the white orchids slipped from my grasp and fell onto the concrete ground with a shattering crash. Dirt scattered everywhere. The white petals, once pure, were dirty and crushed. The symbol of my hope and a new beginning was nothing but ruins. That shattering sound seemed to tear down a wall in my mind, pulling me out of that terrifying reality and sinking me into a distant corner of my memories. A place where the image of Laura, my daughter-in-law, appeared clear and sweet as a dream. I was a widow, and alone I strived to raise Ethan, my only son, until he was a man. My life passed quietly and somewhat solitarily until the day he introduced her to me. I remember that afternoon perfectly. The girl hid shyly behind Ethan. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, her eyes large and clear as an autumn lake, with a touch of shyness, but full of warmth. And then she smiled, a smile capable of dispelling any sadness. In that instant, I knew I would love her like a daughter. She stepped forward, clasped her hands respectfully over her chest, and said in a soft, sincere voice, "Good afternoon." Mom. That word, Mom, so sweet and heartfelt, filled the emptiness that had resided in me for so many years. Since then, my house once again had laughter, meals prepared with care, and one more daughter to look after and love. Their wedding was celebrated on an autumn day under a sun as golden as honey. When giving her the wedding gift, I took her small hand and slipped onto it, the jade bracelet that had belonged to my mother, a pure and fresh green. I looked into her eyes and said, "From today on, you are not only Ethan's wife, you are also my daughter." Laura didn't answer. She just hugged me. Her fragile body trembled, and I felt her hot tears soaking my shoulder. A year later, during a family dinner, Ethan was smiling mysteriously. He handed me a small box with a ribbon. I opened it curiously, and what was inside left me speechless. Tiny knitted white wool booties adorned with a blue ribbon. When I looked up, I saw my 2 children looking at me with hope. Laura nodded gently, placing a hand on her belly with tenderness. At that moment, I burst into tears, not of sadness, but of happiness. A happiness I had waited a lifetime for. The following months were the happiest. I took out my old balls of yarn and began knitting stitch by stitch. Little sweaters, hats, and mittens for my future grandchild. Laura came often. She snuggled on my lap, stroked her already round belly, and laughed, saying, "Mom, it kicked again. He's definitely going to be a mischief maker." Together, we painted the old room, hung white clouds and shining stars, preparing everything to welcome our little angel. But the day that Angel arrived in the world was also the day the gates of hell opened. Ethan and I waited in the cold metal chairs in front of the delivery room while time dragged on, heavy as lead. The ticking of the clock on the wall became the most torturous sound of all. Nurses and doctors went in and out incessantly, their faces tense without anyone saying a single word. My mother's instinct told me something was very wrong. Finally, after a few hours that seemed like an eternity, an older doctor came out. His face reflected a deep weariness. He looked at us with eyes full of compassion and said that Laura had suffered a very severe hemorrhage. They had fought with all their strength to save both of them. and they had succeeded. But to save her life, we had to perform a hysterectomy. I am very sorry. His voice grew grave. She will not be able to get pregnant again. Every word was like an invisible blow that shattered the world we had just built. I looked beside me. Ethan had collapsed in the chair, covering his face with both hands, his body trembling with silent sobs. I felt an iron hand squeezing my chest. The pain was so intense I could barely breathe. When they allowed us to enter, Laura lay in bed, pale and weak. She stared intently at the ceiling with empty eyes. But then, when the nurse placed little Hope, red-faced and wrapped in a white blanket, in her arms, a miracle occurred. Laura's face lit up. The despair disappeared, replaced by an immense love. Trembling, she stroked her daughter's cheek, leaned down, and kissed her forehead, whispering a sacred promise. You are Mummy's only miracle. Hope. From that day on, Laura dedicated her entire life to Hope. Her world narrowed to her daughter's small body. She cared for her with an almost obsessive devotion. Every breath, every movement of the child made her jump. She hardly ever separated from her. She did everything with her own hands, feeding her, bathing her, singing her to sleep. I used to visit often. I cooked nutritious meals like chicken noodle soup and comforting meatloaf for my daughter-in-law and helped her care for the baby. Watching Hope grow day by day, plump, beautiful, with her round cheeks and radiant smile, brought me comfort. I thought that even though the price had been too high, the miracle called Hope would be enough to heal all the wounds, and that from then on our family would live in peace. But that peace I thought I had recovered was as fragile as the fog at dawn, and it vanished as soon as tragedy reappeared. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was in the kitchen kneading dough for biscuits when the phone rang. Seeing Ethan's name, I smiled, thinking of joking with him and asking if he wanted to come over for a piece. But the sound on the other end of the line made my world collapse. It wasn't his usual voice, but a broken, desperate sob. Mom, Mom, he called me. His voice shattered. Hope. The child. Only those words were enough for the ground to move beneath my feet. I didn't ask anything else. I just grabbed my coat and ran out. All the way to the hospital, only my son's sobs echoed in my head. I found them in the waiting room outside the emergency department. Ethan was hunched over, his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling non-stop. And Laura was motionless beside him, sitting upright, her hands in her lap, She wore an impeccable white dress, now stained red, like a sinister flower blooming on snow. Her eyes were fixed on the operating room door, empty, soulless. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking, as if someone had ripped the spirit from her body. Ethan lifted his head, his swollen red eyes looking at me full of guilt. Between sobs with broken words, he began to tell me. When the family was strolling through the park, Hope saw a colourful ice cream truck across the street and shouted excitedly that she wanted one. In the instant, Laura turned around to look for her purse. Just a brief moment, like a blink, Hope's small hand slipped from her mother's. The girl ran into the street, still smiling. A large truck couldn't stop in time. Everything happened too fast, too cruel, snatching the little angel from our family. At the funeral, Laura didn't cry. Among the choked sobs of the relatives, she just stood still next to the small white coffin, like a statue carved in ice. Her gaze no longer settled on anything, lost in a place where only she and an impossible pain existed. The following days, she shut herself in Hope's room. The room we once decorated with joy became a mausoleum of memories. She sat on the floor, hugging the child's worn teddy bear without eating, without drinking, without speaking a word. Ethan had to go back to work after 1 week. He did so with a broken heart and constant fear. Fearing that his wife would do something terrible while alone, I packed some clothes and moved in with them. I cooked soup like a warm clam chowder, brought it to her room, and patiently fed her spoonful by spoonful as if she were a small child. Every night I heard her choked sobs, a soul-breaking sound that came from behind the door. I would go in, hug her, let her cry on my shoulder. But I didn't say anything. Only the hot tears kept falling silently. Approximately 1 month later, when the pain seemed to have calmed down a little, I began to notice strange signs. One day, while cleaning the house, I saw a receipt from a children's clothing store in the trash can. A pink princess dress sized for a 5-year-old girl. I felt a knot in my chest. Hope died before she turned 4. When I asked her, Laura lowered her head and mumbled that she had bought it to donate to an orphanage. Her explanation sounded reasonable, but my instinct told me something wasn't right. Until one day, the neighbor rang the doorbell. Her face showed discomfort and fear. She complained that Laura stood by the fence, staring intently at her granddaughter as she played in the yard. "That girl's look," she said, "had something intense, a mixture of hunger and sadness, and it scared me." Laura was quick to apologize, saying she just missed Hope too much. I had to speak carefully with the neighbor so that she wouldn't make a bigger deal of the matter. But the tension reached its peak late one night. Passing by Hope's room, I saw that the door was ajar, and a faint light was coming from inside. I looked in curiously, and what I saw chilled my blood. Laura was sitting in the rocking chair that Ethan had bought for rocking the baby to sleep. Her arms moved gently, cradling the emptiness in front of her chest, and her lips were singing a lullaby, the same one she used to sing to Hope every night. That familiar melody, now echoing in an empty room, sounded like a ghostly echo, sad and chilling. I couldn't sleep that night. Fear was crushing my heart. At dawn, I called Ethan and told him everything. At first, he dismissed it. He said I worried too much, that Laura was just dealing with her grief in her own way. But when I mentioned the lullaby in the empty room, he was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. I held back my tears. My voice trembled. "Son, we have to take her to see a therapist. I'm afraid she can't take it anymore." At first, Laura reacted with fury. She shouted, saying we thought she was crazy. But in the end, faced with Ethan's and my pleas, she agreed to go to therapy. The following months were truly a miracle. Laura started to look more cheerful. She came out of her room, cleaned the house, cooked delicious things like baked apple pie and barbecue ribs. There was even one day when she invited me to go shopping and picked out a new scarf for me with her own hands. I was moved to tears, silently thanking heaven for giving me back the sweet daughter-in-law I once had. I truly believed that finally she had been strong enough to climb out of the abyss. Seeing her stable, I decided to return to my own house to give them back their private space as a couple. Before leaving, I hugged her tight and said, "If anything happens, call me immediately." She smiled, a genuine smile after so many days, and nodded. 1 month later, Ethan called me on the phone. This time, his voice on the other end of the line wasn't of crying, but of joy and enthusiasm. "Mom, we moved 2 weeks ago. We found a place in the suburbs, very quiet. Laura says the fresh air out there makes her feel better." Hearing that, my heart filled with hope. A new beginning. A new home to leave the painful memories behind. I was so happy for them that I decided to give them a surprise. I went to buy a pot of white orchids, Laura's favorite flower, and packed it carefully to take as a housewarming gift. I didn't know that the surprise I wanted to give them, that pot full of hope, would be what would push me to cross the threshold into a hell I never could have imagined. If this story has touched you, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with others. It helps me grow and reach more people. Mom. "Are you all right?" A worried voice pulled me out of the abyss of memories. I blinked and the tragic image of hope faded, leaving only the broken remains on the ground and the withered orchid petals under my feet. A young police officer was kneeling beside me. His hand carefully held my shoulder. "Can you stand up?" He helped me to my feet. My legs felt so weak, as if they had no bones. My body was trembling. I had to lean on the railing to maintain my balance. All the sounds around seemed muffled. My gaze was fixed on a single point. The basement door wide open like a black mouth, ready to swallow everything. At that moment, the other officer came up from the basement. Each of his steps on the wooden stairs echoed with a sad, dense weight, and then he appeared fully in the light. In his arms, he carried a small girl. The girl wore a faded and old pink nightgown, her bare feet covered in dust. Her brown hair, tangled and matted, covered almost her entire face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was just trembling uncontrollably in the police officer's arms. Her eyes were wide open, distraught and empty, staring straight ahead without seeing, as if she had witnessed something so terrifying that she could no longer react. In one hand, she clutched a worn, stuffed bunny with one ear torn off, as if it were the only lifeline she had left in the world. A newly arrived female officer quickly approached and covered the girl's fragile little body with a light blanket. She turned to me, her voice trying to maintain professional calmness, although I could notice the tremor behind the words. "Ma'am, do you recognize this child?" I stared at the little girl's dirty face, her large eyes, her wide forehead, her small chin. I searched for any familiar feature, a spark of hope that would give a logical explanation to all of this. But no, that face was completely unknown to me. I shook my head without thinking, my throat dry, unable to utter a word. Then, "Do you know why this child was in your son and daughter-in-law's house?" the officer continued. That question was like a knife thrust directly into my heart. What could I answer? I knew nothing. I could only stand there in silence, feeling helpless and guilty for no reason. At that moment, an ambulance and another police car stopped in front of the gate, breaking the heavy silence. The officer in command signaled his team to continue searching the entire house. Minutes later, another voice echoed from the basement, firm and cold, informing his superior. "Sir, down here there's a thin mattress on the cement floor, some children's clothing, several boxes of canned food, and bottles of water. There is also a plastic potty. Everything indicates that someone has been living here for quite some time." Every word he said was like an invisible punch directly to my head. Those phrases combined painted a terrifying picture of confinement. of a life deprived of sunlight. This was not an accident. It was something planned with intent. The female officer tried to talk to the girl, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "What is your name? Don't be afraid. We are going to help you." But the little girl just shook her head vigorously, hiding her face under the blanket, curled up like a wounded animal. They decided to take her to the hospital immediately to check her health and calm her down. The ambulance slowly drove away, taking the terrible newly discovered secret out of that quiet street. I stood motionless, watching the vehicle until it disappeared around the bend. My mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. A shiver ran down my spine. Trembling, I took the phone out of my purse and with numb fingers dialed Ethan's number. The ringtone sounded, each beep long and slow, devouring the last spark of hope I had left. "The number you have dialed is not available." The cold voice of the voicemail cut off any attempt. My heart sank. Maybe he was in a meeting, I told myself, trying to calm down as I dialed Laura's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. The ring continued insistently, prolonged and desperate, piercing the silence of the afternoon. I held my breath, praying that she would answer, that she would give me an explanation, even an absurd one. But after several rings, the phone shut off. No one answered. The silence from both sides of the line became unbearable, and a feeling of terror began to envelop my chest, squeezing my heart tightly. Where were they? Why wasn't either of them answering right now? And the child locked in the basement. Who was she really? The officer in command approached me and Mr. Lewis. His face no longer showed surprise, but the seriousness of someone who fears the worst. In a grave and firm voice, he said, "Ma'am, sir, we need to take your initial statements. Please sit here for a moment." He pointed to the wooden bench on the porch, the same one where I had imagined Ethan and Laura reading together. I walked unsteadily and let myself fall onto the seat. I felt as if all my energy had been drained, leaving me empty. Mr. Lewis sat beside me, his rough gardener's hands intertwined over his knees. The bench creaked slightly with a sad, melancholy sound. A young police officer took out a notebook and a pen. He sat across from us and began questioning Mr. Lewis first. "Could you tell us in detail what you have seen and heard these past few days?" "Sir?" The man cleared his throat, his gaze lost on the open door of the house, as if trying to piece together a strange puzzle. "It all started a little over 1 week ago, just after Ethan and his wife moved in. Every night, young man, without fail, around 10 p.m., when the whole neighborhood was already quiet. I would hear a soft lullaby coming from that house next door. A lullaby, the police officer repeated while writing non-stop. Yes, a very familiar lullaby. I felt my heart stopped for an instant. He continued. It was a woman's voice, very low, barely a whisper. But since the nights here are so quiet, it was clearly audible. The melody repeated over and over. But the strange thing was that sometimes between the song I would hear a child's muffled cry, a contained cry that was immediately silenced, as if someone was afraid of being heard from outside. A knot formed in my throat. The familiar lullaby, the silenced crying. In my mind, the melody Laura sang to Hope countless times began to play, a tender melody full of love, which now, in Mr. Lewis's words, had become a sinister and disturbing sound. A few days ago, he continued, pulling me out of my thoughts, I saw the young man, Ethan, arrive home. When he came out to the garden to water the new potted plants, I approached to say hello. I asked him directly, Do you have visitors? A child? Perhaps, he smiled. A tired smile, but he dismissed it. He told me, Of course not. You must have misheard some neighbor's TV. We don't have children. He said it so convincingly that I chose to keep quiet. I thought maybe I'm old and hearing things that aren't there. Hearing that, a mixture of sadness and disappointment washed over me. Ethan, my son, had been warned, but he dismissed it. He was so absorbed in his work, in his own problems, that he didn't realize the turmoil brewing inside his own home. But this morning, there was no longer room for doubt. Mr. Lewis's voice became firm. His eyes reflected determination. I was pruning my rose bushes when I heard a heartbreaking scream. It was a child's voice, clear and desperate. It shouted, Help! Help! Only 2 words and then silence, as if someone had covered its mouth. It was at that moment that I knew I couldn't keep waiting. The young police officer looked up from his notebook. Before that, besides the singing and the crying, did you notice anything else strange? Mr. Lewis nodded thoughtfully. Yes. Last week there was also a scream, but it was an adult's. Laura's voice, a high-pitched scream full of fear. I was worried. I thought they were arguing or that there was a burglar. So I asked an officer who patrols around here to go check it out. She opened the door herself, he recounted. She looked calm. She even smiled and said, Oh, I'm sorry for scaring you. Sir, I saw a huge cockroach and I started screaming. She said it very naturally, but there was something odd. She stood right in the doorway. She only partially opened the door without letting anyone see inside. Since there were no signs of trouble, the officer left. Mr. Lewis's testimony ended. I remembered that Laura had always been terrified of insects. Her explanation sounded perfect. But now, in this context, that perfection was the most unsettling thing. It was a carefully planned lie. Mr. Lewis looked at me. His eyes no longer showed fright, but pity, understanding, and an unmovable conviction. He spoke softly but loud enough for the police officer and me to hear him. I know that something very strange is happening in that house. Mom, an old man's intuition is never wrong. The officer in command politely thanked him and allowed him to leave. He nodded. He cast a look full of compassion at me and slowly crossed the street, his steps heavy. The small street returned to a terrifying silence. Only I remained. A few police officers who continued to search the place, and a horrible truth that was still hidden behind a veil of mystery. I sat alone on the porch swing. It swayed gently with the wind, emitting a sad, mournful creak, like the sigh of the house itself. Every detail of Mr. Lewis's story was stabbing into my mind like fragments of glass, sharp and painful. The lullaby, the silenced crying, the lie about the cockroach, and the desperate scream for help. Everything mingled in a chaotic whirlwind that destroyed any faith, any hope I had tried to maintain. I thought Laura had overcome it, but maybe she never truly managed to escape the ghost of the past. She was only dragging us deeper into it. At that moment, the young police officer who had accompanied the girl to the ambulance returned. He walked quickly with long, decisive strides, his face much more serious than before. He didn't say anything. He went straight to the officer in command who was near the door and showed him something on his tablet screen. The commander squinted. He observed attentively. I noticed a small twitch on his face before he looked up and stared directly at me. His gaze was no longer professional or distant, but a strange mixture of determination, compassion, and something that resembled a warning. He didn't say a word. He just gestured with his head for the young police officer to speak to me. The officer approached me, and each of his steps felt like a crushing weight on my chest. He stopped in front of me. He took a deep breath, seeking courage. His voice trembled slightly, as if carefully choosing the least cruel words possible. Ma'am, we have just cross-referenced the information from the hospital. He paused. The child found in the basement matches a report of a missing minor. My ears were ringing. All sound around me faded. I only heard the frantic pounding of my heart. Missing, he continued. And this time, every word sounded clear, heavy, like hammer blows on my shattered soul. The girl's name is Sophia Davis. She is 5 years old. The disappearance report was filed exactly 2 weeks ago in the city's Central Park. 2 weeks. That number pierced me like a thorn. 2 weeks. Exactly the amount of time since Ethan had happily told me they had moved into this house. Exactly the amount of time that I naively believed they were starting a new life. But that new beginning had been built upon the end of another family. The young police officer seemed to read the horror in my eyes. He asked cautiously, trying to maintain objectivity in his voice. "Mom, is it true that your son and daughter-in-law moved here around that date?" I couldn't answer. My throat felt closed, as if someone was squeezing it. I could only nod faintly, an almost imperceptible movement, but as heavy as a confession. "We have contacted the girl, Sophia's biological parents," he added with a compassionate tone upon seeing my state. "They are on their way to the hospital. They have been searching for their daughter tirelessly for 2 weeks. They were on the verge of madness." Every word of his painted the tragic picture of another family more strongly. A family I didn't know, but whose destiny was now intertwined with mine by a thread of guilt and horror. After a deathly silence, the young police officer's voice became firm, solemn, charged with the full weight of the law. "Ma'am, with the evidence found at the scene and the witnesses' statements, we have sufficient grounds to issue an arrest warrant for Mrs. Laura Vega for the crime of child kidnapping. Your son, Mr. Ethan Torres, will also be summoned for questioning as an involved person, possibly as an accomplice." That phrase fell like a lightning bolt, tearing the already grey sky that weighed over my head. Arrest. Laura. Investigate. Ethan. Accomplice. Those words were like poisoned daggers stabbing my heart. My legs gave way. I could no longer remain sitting on the rocking chair. My entire body collapsed, falling onto the cold stone steps. The world around me began to spin, to wobble. Laura, my sweet and kind daughter-in-law, the girl I loved so much. A kidnapper. Ethan, my only son whom I dedicated my whole life to raising and protecting. An accomplice? No, it couldn't be. A silent no screamed inside my mind. There had to be a terrible mistake, a cruel coincidence. My daughter-in-law was just a desperate mother. She couldn't have done something so monstrous. My son was just a distracted husband, not a criminal. but the faint cry of a child was real. The secret room in the basement was real. Mr. Lewis's testimony was real. And the missing little Sophia Davis was also real. I no longer knew what to believe. The evening began to fall, staining the entire neighborhood with a sad, dull orange hue. I remained sitting on the icy steps, huddled in my thin coat. And then, in the midst of that terrifying silence, a familiar,